Deltarune YouTube has a clickbait problem. If it wasn't made clear enough by that ridiculous thumbnail, this video isn't really about predicting the story of Deltarune using some theory with a catchy name. I think I have some interesting things to say about Deltarune, specifically revolving around a single line of text in Chapter 4 which has lived rent-free in my head for months now, and that I've thought about at least once a day since I read it. But I'll get to that. First, I want to talk about my process, and why the current YouTube trend of theories and predictions surrounding this game kind of bugs me. When you look at your homepage on YouTube, and you see all that sweet juicy content to fill the aching hole that's been left in all of our collective chests where Chapter 5 would one day sit, you're going to see 101 different Jockington Goner Theory videos sitting there waiting to be consumed. Spoilers for Chapters 1 through 4, by the way. When I see these videos, often they follow a similar pattern. They take their one-line snappy theory and present it as a thesis to be proved. Then, like filling a bucket, they piece through the game's text and imagery searching for drops of evidence to pour into said Death Knight Theory bucket. They might even, if they're thorough, place a second Kris Knight Theory bucket down in front of you and fill that up too. Then, our helpful theorists measure each bucket and make a determination. This bucket is fuller than that bucket, this theory is more likely than that theory, this is my prediction for what is right, and I've solved Tricky Tony's puzzle. And everyone happily lancers away with their theory pail, or unhappily laments that they missed this and that evidence droplet that fills their Papyrus Knight Theory bucket way fuller than all the others, and so on and so forth. But that's not really how I like to think about media, especially not episodic media like Deltarune, where we've got so much time to think about and digest each piece of it, while desperately craving the rest of it, like a Hollow Knight fan craving the next game showcase, praying for the slightest bit of news about Silksong. Just a quick editing note, the script was written on August 18th, 2025. It feels antagonistic to the author and to the readers. Like Toby Fox is out to get me and I need to be one step ahead. Like I need to know what's the most likely twists and turns to happen, and if I see them coming, then I won and I was smarter than Fantastic Mr. Toby, and anyone who thought Asriel's dust theory was right was a big dumb idiot who lost. Instead, I like to look at a story like Deltarune's as a portrait that Toby Fox and his team are painstakingly sketching with one line of dialogue, one musical leitmotif, one extraordinary boss fight at a time. With every chapter, we get to see more of those strokes on the canvas, slowly revealing itself as, in this case, for no particular reason, let's say a tree. The main events of the story form the trunk, the branches and leaves, all the side plots, mysteries, and characters that flesh out the world and give our cast the motivations and drives to carry the plot forward. But we don't get to see the whole canvas, just bits and pieces that together create an illusion in the darker yet darker negative space between what we can see. Questions like, what caused Asgore to leave the police force? And what's the deal with the song from the sea? Act like the bases of these branches, stretching off into these blank spaces to one day be sketched to completion by an annoying dog. This negative space is where speculation and theorizing happens. It's where we can visualize all the different ways this tree could be drawn that connect and intertwine all these lingering threads in a cohesive way. Not to try and deduce how the tree will actually look, but to follow the brushstrokes Toby Fox is giving us and understanding the myriad ways the tree could look like in full, and what any of these could mean for the story it's trying to tell. Circling all the way back to the reason I'm making this video in the first place. It's one of these patches of negative space that I can't stop thinking about, but I can't with any confidence say what it means for the story of Deltarune, and it hinges entirely on one little piece of flavor text, a throwaway line amongst hundreds, unassuming and innocent, just like any other dialogue box to mash through as the player obsessively interacts with every object in every room. My mom just collects heart pillows for some reason. When Kris was little, they'd take one of these, then pretend to rip out their heart and chase me. What the fuck does that mean? No, seriously, how am I supposed to interpret this flavor text? What do you mean when they were little they would rip out their heart and chase Noelle? Am I supposed to read that literally, like they were playing pretend and chasing her? Am I supposed to think Noelle didn't know any better and that Kris was actually pulling out their soul in front of her? Is it just a fourth wall breaking joke that I'm not supposed to even think about? Toby Fox, I swear, if you think you're... Sorry, I got a little carried away. But I am being honest when I say I cannot stop thinking about this line. In every interpretation that isn't just, this is a funny haha joke to show Kris is a prankster and they never literally pretended to chase Noelle around with a heart-shaped object, my mind keeps reeling at the implications. Keeping to the metaphor from before, I start drawing the rest of the branch that stretches from this point, and in some cases it just turns into some eldritch horror abomination that swallows the rest of the tree whole, and as soon as I turn away from it, I've forgotten it ever existed in the first place. 3. Broadly stated, I think there are three possible ways to interpret this line that make any amount of sense to my brain. In order from least shatters my brain to most. Number 1. It's just something Kris does. Kris, with their dog-like animal instinct, at a young age had a habitual impulse to tear their soul from their body, and, seeing their horrific potential, decided to chase Noelle around with it, or with a pillowy simulacrum. This answer is probably the closest to the cop-out answer of just don't think about it lol, and it doesn't really satisfy the picture of a trio analogy I used earlier. It completes this little branch, sure, but it doesn't connect to any of our other lingering questions, it doesn't add substantially to the picture being drawn, and what it does add comes across as a little silly. This is the bucket theory that I think is the most likely, and if I were in the game to score prediction points, this is what I'd pick, and I'd go on with my life. But instead of settling for the likely, but unsatisfying answer, let's paint a different picture. Possibility number 2. Someone taught Kris to do it. Kris, when they were little, was instructed on how to remove their soul from their body. Whether it's something all humans can accomplish, or if there's some prerequisite to the ability that was given at the time of, or potentially long after, that instruction, Kris was informed that such an action was possible by somebody. You can start to paint a whole lot of different pictures with this start, and it certainly ties in with a lot of lingering questions and ideas that we're left with. To start with, we need to pick some potential candidates for this someone, and they need to meet some criteria. 1. Knowledge of the human soul. You can't instruct Kris if you don't already know the mechanics of the human soul and how to extract it. 2. Familiarity with the young Kris. You can't instruct Kris if you've never interacted with Kris, and Noelle specifies the age as when Kris was little, implying that at least a somewhat significant amount of time has passed since then. That's all for the hard requirements. Some other things we can consider. 3. Motive for helping or hurting Kris. It's not entirely clear whether Kris's ability to remove their soul is entirely a positive or a negative. We don't know what impact it has on Kris as a person, other than it seems to have opened opportunities for them, while also exposing them to some harm. A strong motive for inflicting those effects, whether they skew positively or negatively, is a consideration here. 4. Motive for enabling Kris. By that I mean, whether or not the character has something to gain by teaching Kris this ability, and whether this nebulous someone needs or wants Kris to be able to remove their soul for some purpose. Let's start by looking at characters that have already been introduced to the story. Carol Holiday. Carol is perhaps the most glaringly obvious choice. In all likelihood, Carol is the voice, or one of the voices on the phone with Kris in Chapter 4. Her involvement in the story is clearly being set up as major, and it would make sense to intertwine her in Kris's early life. Let's start looking at our criteria. 1. Knowledge of the human soul. From the knowledge we have, it's a safe bet that right now, at the moment in time taking place in the present of Deltarune, Carol is familiar with the human soul. The text this video revolves around takes place when examining red heart-shaped pillows in the Holiday household, plus Noelle's line, "My mom just collects heart pillows for some reason," indicating they belong to Carol is suspicious on its own, but combined with the phone call lines, "Need soul, without soul, Kris will," and "Kris, dark world, no soul, can't," that in all likelihood, Carol spoke, or was privy to being spoken, means she's aware of, and maybe even has a particular fascination with, Kris's human soul. Now, I was specific about presently, in this moment, Carol most likely knowing. It's harder to extrapolate that years and years into the past when the Dreamers and the Holidays were close. There's plenty of potential for Carol acquiring this knowledge and perhaps obsession long after Kris chased Noelle around with a heart-shaped object. For example, something terrible happens, perhaps to her daughter Des, which prompts Carol's involvement in the plot via a very soul-related conspiracy with Kris and a random night, which necessitates fountains to be created and subsequently closed by use of a human soul. But this picture works just as well with Carol possessing this knowledge from the beginning, and simply later putting it into practice with a decidedly unfun gang. I mark this criteria possible, but not guaranteed. 2. familiarity with young Kris. An obvious yes, we've been treated to many examples of the two families' closeness at the time. Moving on to the softer considerations. 3. Motive for helping or hurting Kris. This one simply doesn't have enough evidence in the text to say one way or the other. We know Carol is portrayed with an icy disposition, but she's also shown a fondness for Kris, depending on your read of this scene. But how much of that is manipulation, or how her feelings have shifted in the years since Carol would have helped or hurt Kris by teaching them how to tear their soul out, is just impossible to know at this stage. Consider this criteria insubstantial. 4. Motive for enabling Kris. Here's another clear yes. If you subscribe to the belief that Carol is the voice on the phone, in league with Kris and potentially other conspirators, Kris's human soul, based on the phone call, plays some pivotal role in Carol's plans, and Kris's ability to act independently of their soul is what allows them to attempt to accomplish Carol's instruction to keep Susie away from the guitar. And that's Carol Holiday. Here we can see some of these plot threads start to tie together. Carol could have taught Kris at a young age in order to facilitate whatever conspiracy she and Kris are engaging in the present day, and doing so is what puts our heroes in motion from the very start. I think this is a fairly grounded explanation, and ties in nicely with what we already can surmise about Carol and Kris's relationship and power dynamics. This is probably the last sane thing that will be said in this video. Let's move on to the next candidate. The Vessel Creator. The mysterious disembodied bundle of all-caps text who regularly possesses Toby Fox's social media accounts and whom the community is collectively convinced with good reason is our old friend Dr. W.D. Gaster. This is one of those theory buckets that's so full of evidence it's hard to ignore, but for the sake of completeness, I'm going to make the distinction between Gaster-based and non-Gaster-based evidence, including any assumptions being made about whether this potential Gaster is the same as, or a similar archetype to, Undertale's former royal scientist, W.D. Gaster. On to the criteria. 1. Knowledge of the human soul. Even without assuming the Gaster connection, it's safe to assume the Vessel Creator has some specialized knowledge of the soul, specifically shown in the very first scene of the game, where the Vessel Creator establishes some sort of connection to the soul. 2. Familiarity with the young Kris. This is murky as all hell. It can really only be speculated about because we know so little about the Vessel Creator's past in Deltarune, but I will put forward a hypothetical. If the Vessel Creator were a tangible, real, non-disembodied character to be found somewhere in hometown, where would they be most likely to be found? Take a moment to think about it. Purely based on vibes, I'd wager 95% of you said one of 3 locations. The shelter, the school, or across the lake / at the source of the mysterious song coming from the deep. The shelter, because of its centrality to the plot, its mysterious nature, and the parallels we can draw thematically between it and Undertale's True Lab. The school, because if the Vessel Creator really is Gaster, it would make sense narratively if their profession mirrors Alphys's. And across the lake, because it's such a glaring unknown that's just as mysterious as our mystery man. One of those, the shelter, we've good reason to believe Kris has had some involvement with in the past, given Monster Kid and Snowy's conversation at the shelter door, plus the shelter door opening for Kris, and Kris's reluctance to let us into the digital version of the shelter. So, with a lot of assuming, we can craft a version of this Vessel Creator that could have conceivably had contact with the young Kris at the shelter. Possible, but largely vibes-based and unsupported by the text. We'll at least say that the Vessel Creator isn't ruled out by this criteria, but there's nothing helping their case here either. 3. Motive for helping or hurting Kris. There's nothing here. We have no insight into any sort of relationship here. Next. 4. Motive for enabling Kris. This one's more interesting. The Vessel Creator has shown some level of investment, attached interest, morbid curiosity in the events transpiring. In some manner, the Vessel Creator seems to have some hand in our, the players, involvement in the story via the Vessel creation sequence, which leads to us controlling Kris. In Chapter 3, the Vessel Creator seems to cheer us on in our struggle against the Night, And at the end of chapter 4, the line, "my Deltarune," can be interpreted in so many different ways, ranging from Gaster being the progenitor of the prophecy to Toby just deciding to break the fourth wall and thank the player with his spooky, scary, creepy voice. But if the vessel creator is invested in how the story of Deltarune is playing out, then enabling one of the major forces of the story, Kris's soul possession and unpossession, certainly tracks. Fair marks overall for the vessel creator, and enough threads looping into our picture to make things a little more interesting, but as a bucket theory, it's not very full yet. Egg. That's the best I could come up with for this category, because it's the only through line that ties my thoughts together with this candidate. I think most would jump here to call the Forgotten Man my third candidate, and while I don't necessarily think they'd be wrong to do so, I'm not ready to make that leap. But the egg scenes bring with them some strong implications, which are, Kris is repressing some memory from their past, which is represented by the Forgotten Man and the scenes surrounding him. Kris sought, or was provided, psychiatric help, likely to do with whatever event or memory they are repressing. Both of which lead to Kris going all Lady Macbeth in their art club where they draw pictures and don't kill each other. This creates a hole in the story, a new one to fill with some unknown person or people. Namely, persons involved in Kris's repressed memory, and persons involved in aiding Kris with dealing with that memory. Kris's penchant for removing their soul could be either related to the memory they are repressing, or a method of dealing with that trauma taught to them by someone. With those assumptions, let's look at the criteria. 1. Knowledge of the human soul. No evidence for or against. There's plenty of reason, if we go with a mental health practitioner, that they would have the requisite knowledge, but there's nothing here for us really. 2. Familiarity with the young Kris. This is the strongest connection we have for an egg-related soul sensei. The photocopied runins firmly anchor these memories in Kris's far past. Have you been working out? I guess you grew up. Whatever Kris has been dealing with, the timeline lines up with Noelle's statement. 3. Motive for helping or hurting Kris. Another strong connection. We know this event had a significant enough impact to spawn the egg rooms. We know someone was trying to help Kris through their issues. Whether helping or hurting, this fits. 4. Motive for enabling Kris. Nothing. There's nothing to tangibly represent what there is to selfishly gain for this mysterious category of person by teaching Kris. Fair marks once again. This picture we're drawing hits to some of the emotional core of Kris, but ignores the mechanics of the soul and its actual teaching to Kris. It's funny. It's almost the exact opposite to the vessel creator, who had all the marks for the soul knowledge but none of the emotional core. Gaster Egg. Well, would you look at that? The best of both, painting a pretty cohesive picture that ties the emotional core to the literal interpretation. Before chapters 3 and 4 came out, this was the full bucket theory that people touted and rallied behind, but it's definitely fallen out of favor since. There's a lot of evidence the vessel creator and the Forgotten Man are two separate entities, and perhaps even antagonistic to each other. But that's part of why I said I wanted to ignore that which bucket's most full thinking. To me, this is a puzzle piece that fits and ties together so many of these lingering threads, and it's an artistic vision of the Deltarune tree that I could see settling into place. The vessel creator, wanting something from the events of the Deltarune prophecy, takes steps to fulfilling it, putting those gears into motion. They position themselves as a person of trust for Kris, like a therapist, another common theory for the identity of the Forgotten Man, taking that opportunity to sow the seeds of the prophecy, and craft for themselves the cage with human soul and parts. Kris, with this knowledge, uses it in a very Kris-like fashion to terrorize Noelle. But that's not to discount our other prime candidate in Carol, or any other potential candidates. I don't think my example proposal is the most likely, or the most well-supported, or even the most cohesive explanation. It's just one amongst many that are fun and interesting to think about. Some way Toby Fox can start to tie the events of the story together as we pass the halfway mark, many conflicts and questions he's been posing to us over the course of the first 4 chapters. But what do you think? Did I miss a potential candidate, a crucial piece of evidence for the buckets that disproves my whole thing? When are we... Huh? What's that? A third possibility? I don't remember mentioning anything like that. It's just something Kris does, or someone taught Kris to do it. Those are the only 2 ways they could possibly be. Don't look at the title of the video. Possibility number 3. Kris saw someone do it. AKA, Kris is the second soul possession theory. Alright, let's get weird with it. This is the very first thought I had. The one that started me on the rabbit hole of trying to think of other explanations, and really why my brain kept coming back to this flavor text again and again until I put it all into words like this. Kids love to mimic what they see. With their pliant little brains, they suck up everything the adults and older kids in their lives do like sponges, and then they wring themselves out and reproduce those behaviors ad nauseum until they drive everyone around them batshit crazy. If Kris saw someone reach into their chest and pull out a heart-shaped object, that would be a much simpler explanation than someone actively teaching Kris about soul mechanics that they need to know in their far-flung future. Kris wouldn't have to know that it was a person's soul. Kris could just see something creepy happen, see a close analog sitting on the Holiday's hallway table, and recreate what they saw, chasing poor Noelle around with it while neither grasped the true existential horror of yanking your font of will and compassion out of your chest and weaponizing it against someone. To me, this idea of Kris just mimicking someone else fits the characterization of the young Kris we've gotten as a rambunctious little menace out to cause mischief in ways that they think will be fun. Shaking Ferris wheel cars, flushing bath bombs, convincing your childhood friends that Charles Entertainment Cheese eats children. It doesn't rely on someone foreseeing the need for a human soul-wielding vessel a decade into the future, or some wild coincidence that a coping mechanism turns out to be wildly useful to the evil group chat. But it still leaves us with a question of who. Someone, before Kris, had a need to rip out their own soul. Let's bring back my favorite thinking tool, some handy-dandy criteria. 1. Familiarity with the young Kris. Gee, this sure sounds familiar. Kris can't copy what they can't see. 2. Soul. Bonus points for a red human soul. From Undertale, our assumption is that monster souls are white and heart-shaped, but in Deltarune we've never seen one, nor are they ever really described. The closest we have that I could find is in the first book on souls. It's book 1 about souls. Read it. The soul has long been called many things: the font of our compassion, the source of our will, the container of our life force, but even now the true function of it is unknown. Nothing there about being specific to human souls, so we can probably assume this is a book written by monsters, and that the "our" determiner is being used to refer to either just monsters or monsters and humans. But either way, Rousey helpfully confirms for us that the book holds true for humans regardless of the monster author's intent. The second thing I could find to perhaps indicate monsters have heart-shaped souls comes from Spanton. All you have to do is show me. Your heart-shaped object. You're a lightner, aren't you? You've got the light. Why don't you show it off? Spanton spoke like he was after a lightner's soul, not specifically a human soul. He doesn't ever make a distinction between Kris as a human versus a lightner, so it's possible a monster heart-shaped object could have been just as good. All that is to say, really the only thing this criteria outright excludes is darkners. Probably. They might have souls too. Human souls, monster souls, book souls. God damn it, Bibliox, what do you mean book souls? Now for the softer criteria again. 3. A reason to rip their soul out. Even if we assume it isn't a special ability Kris has, that anyone can tear their soul out if they're determined enough to do so, it still doesn't seem like a pleasant enough process that you do so on a whim. 4. They're not around anymore. This is the weird one. It's one that I've settled on more from a storytelling and writing perspective than for any strict logical reason. If there were a second person who could tear their soul from their body in Hometown, who was involved in Kris's life, how would they not have already come up? Wouldn't they be going around closing dark fountains? They're likely to be human, or in possession of a human soul. Wouldn't that person be seen or mentioned at some point already? If there's a second soul ripper, there's probably some reason they're out of the picture. Now, who are the candidates for who Kris could have seen pulling their soul from their body? Kris's birth parents. These are really the only humans that we can be certain actually exist. Let's jump right into the criteria. 1. Familiarity with the young Kris. Yep, that's an easy W for mom and dad, or NB parents 1 and 2. We don't know how old exactly Kris was when the Dreamers adopted them, but Kris's reaction to unfamiliar humans when reading the book How to Take Care of Humans makes me think Kris has some lingering memories with other humans, which very well could be their parents. Which would mean Kris would have been old enough to have seen one of their parents yank their soul out for whatever reason, if they're still holding on to memories from back then. 2. Soul. Yep, another W, and human too. Color's up in the air, but red could run in the family for all we know. 3. A reason to rip their soul out. Truthfully, I got nothing here. L plus ratio parents. And 4. They're not around anymore. Nothing to say here. Kris's parents are gone, hence the adoption. Well, that was quick and easy. Surely the same will be true of the next candidate. This is one of those situations where the criteria really doesn't tell the whole picture. Factually, Kris's parents make sense. They fit 3 of our 4 bullet points perfectly, but the conclusion is a bit unsatisfying. It doesn't actually teach us anything about Kris's past. It doesn't introduce anything we didn't already know. Wow, Kris's parents had human souls. What a twist. And it doesn't really answer any of our lingering questions. This is probably the second most boring outcome after it's just something humans do, and feels like a corollary to it without some satisfying explanation for why one of their parents would rip their soul out. Next. Egg. Well, hello again. Nice to see you, hope you've been well. In this form, decidedly ungastery, with an added bonus of human spice thrown into the mix. Particularly with the non-descriptions of the Forgotten Man we've gotten, of the many things we haven't been told, us not being told the man is a monster man is a glaring one. Freed from a Gaster Egg theory bucket, the possibility of a forgotten human man starts to fill our missing segments of the tree in quite nicely. 1. Familiarity with the young Kris. Not going to retread this ground, see our earlier egg discussion. 2. A soul. Particularly if we're discussing a potentially human forgotten man, this fits our criteria quite nicely. But remember, the egg category is broad, and covers anyone involved in Kris's repressed trauma event. Plenty of Lightners with souls of the monster variety that could fit this bill too. A catch-all fit, but particularly relevant if we are narrowing our scope to a human sitting behind that tree. 3. A reason to rip their soul out. This one is always tough. It's just difficult to imagine why someone would do it. Even the example we have, Kris, it's still difficult to parse exactly why Kris sometimes tears us out and sometimes keeps us in, when the opposite in any given situation seems like it might be the better choice. Why not tear us out when we're psychologically tormenting their classmates? Or worse, forcing Kris to pray for Asriel? You put your hands together and said his name blankly. Why does Kris seem to resent this choice again, and outright resists praying for Noelle even on a non-weird playthrough? I'm already getting off track. 4. They're not around anymore. If we're talking about the Forgotten Man specifically, I'll count his strange non-existence as not around anymore. For the rest, not so much. Context clues tells us the rest of the people involved in Kris's fucked-up past are hometowners, so they're still kicking. Anything that helps us answer questions about this gap in Kris's history and shine a light on the Forgotten Man is a win in my book, but there's some messed up context with this one. If the Forgotten Man really is a source of trauma for Kris, and for some reason Kris witnessed the Forgotten Man tearing his soul from his chest, I think Kris would be less willing to turn that into a form of play acting. It makes me feel like we're still missing something, and if we have other options to explore, that's usually a good sign we're barking up the wrong tree. Still, with more context, this could fit, but instead, let's consider, finally, at long last, the title of the video. The second soul possession theory. In this case, the presumption is that Kris is the second person in Hometown to be possessed by a soul, either through an external force puppeting their own soul or by accepting a foreign soul into their body. Our candidate is whomever underwent the first soul possession. We're rooting around in the darkness with this one, so to start, I'm going to ask that you just put to the side needing to justify the first possession's existence. We're looking to this primarily to see how it fits as an explanation for Kris chasing Noelle around with a soul lookalike, but we'll do some theory bucket filling for this as a treat later. Promise. Criteria time. 1. Familiarity with the young Kris. Unless we dive back into the shelter conspiracy hole, we're not served well starting here. And unlike other times when this criteria has been inconclusive, this time it seems like a more unlikely than so situation for Kris to happen to associate with whoever's being possessed unless we can nail down their identity. A poor start. 2. A soul. That's better. Someone being possessed by a soul is guaranteed to have a soul, and human at that if we're talking about a human soul possession. I'll take a truism here, no problem. 3. A reason to rip their soul out. This to me is the most appealing reason to fit a second soul possession into this box. It's maybe the only way I can conceivably justify, without any other context or info, why someone would want to rip their soul out. They could have done it for simply the same reasons Kris does it, to temporarily wrest control of their body back from the possessing soul. To act under their own will instead of via an external source of will. 4. They're not around anymore. We can do a bit of speculating with this one. If the original soul possessee were still around, why would we, the player, the controller of the red heart soul, be involved in the story at all? Why would we be possessing Kris? I can imagine some scenarios. Both soul possessions could have been brought about by different methods or by different opposing factions with different goals, but each of these scenarios tends to increase the complexity of the situation. Possible, but definitely inconclusive. Criteria 3 is our only stronghold here, and it's the reason I want to come back to this so we don't get too mired in the weeds, because there's one more candidate who I'm sure everyone has been screaming at me to mention. December Holiday. Everyone's favorite medieval times cosplaying, wibblebat swinging, Asriel shirt possessing rock band aficionado who may or may not be speaking to data miners in their dreams. You can't discuss Deltarune's mysteries without talking about everyone's favorite antlered big sister. She's the mystery box and the solution to every theorist's clickbait headline, the perfect scapegoat appreciator that lets us throw our hands up in the air and call our theories dead ends until Toby drip feeds us some sweet vague posted blog pieces. Let's see which of our requirements Des meets. 1. Familiarity with the young Kris. Check. 2. A soul. Check. Not human though, too bad, no bonus points. 3. A reason to rip their soul out. Big X. Second soul possession theory stays winning on this one. 4. They're not around anymore. She's the lost girl. She's the first person you thought of when I listed this criteria 10 minutes ago. Regardless of whether she's the knight, or the voice in the code, or long dead and buried, Des ain't exactly around for the majority of Hometown. Possible exceptions being the Doomsday WhatsApp group. And that's it. Not much to say unfortunately, which kind of brings our analysis to a dead end. The failure to meet criteria 3 unfortunately really hurts the overall picture if we fill in our blank with Des. Too many loose ends tied up, lack of cohesion, and the fact that she's a monster soul instead of a human one is human Des theory. Hello, eldritch horror abomination from my nightmares. We're going right off the deep end with this one, everyone, so strap in. But first, some disclaimers. The human Des theory bucket is substantially less full than the Des is a deer obviously bucket. It takes several leaps in logic to conclude that Des is actually a human. The shoes in her room, specifically for hooved feet, the antlers in the flashback, and the lack of anyone mentioning Des's humanness, despite that fact being obviously relevant to Kris. Those leaps are someone else's shoes. They are in a box of stuff that definitely isn't all hers. Kris has horns too, so she could be wearing a headband. And no one wants to talk about Des at all, so her being human wouldn't have come up. If, and only if, we make those leaps, then we can fill our human Des theory bucket with the pile of very regular looking shoes in our closet, the human soul-shaped objects in that same closet, and some cherry-picked and questionably canon Undertale dialogue. Thankfully, Des actually being human isn't pivotal to what I want to talk about, which is Des as a candidate for both the original soul possessee and the person Kris saw pulling their soul from their chest. Des being human is just some added spice that ties things together a bit neater. Back to our criteria, and just like with Who Could Have Taught Kris, this time we get to combine the best of two candidates together. 1. Familiarity with the young Kris. Check again. 2. A soul. Human this time, since we can assume the soul Des would be possessed by is human. This is why a human Des is a bit neater than a monster Des for this circumstance. We don't need to explain why Des can hold a human soul without issue, but we can just as easily envision a world where monster Des holds the human soul for some time, and everything seems fine, and then in a true lab amalgamate situation things go wrong, and that's how she ends up as the lost girl. But focusing on our little blank space on the canvas, human Des is a cleaner way to connect the lines together. The bucket's still rickety and full of holes though. 3. A reason to rip their soul out. A worthwhile candidate for a solid criteria 3. If Des is possessed by a soul, ripping it out comes with all of the reasons and justifications Kris has. And 4. They're not around anymore. And now we're a solid 4 for 4 on our criteria. With all that in mind, before we conclude with our soul puppeted friend here, let's jump back to what I promised earlier. Justification for the second soul possession theory in the first place, with the context of Des, human or monster, as a potential first possessee. The first thing I want to touch on is the prophecy. Specifically, the first hero, the cage with human soul and parts. There's been a lot of discussion already about how well the Fun Gang correlate to the 3 described heroes, with a vast majority of it surrounding the second hero, the girl. But plenty of time and thought and discussion has gone into imagining an original 3 heroes, predating our Fun Gang, and a second soul possession, a second cage with human soul, and if a human Des, parts, slots right in. Next is Carol's strange interest with the human soul. My mom just collects heart pillows for some reason. Combined with what could be pillows but look distinct from Carol's in Des's closet. The ones in Des's closet are particularly peculiar simply due to their location. They're really thrown way into the back of the closet, judging by the closet always being open on the right-hand door, like she regularly acquired and then threw these objects deep into the closet, shoved against and stacked on top of one another, kind of like how Kris always disposes of their own red soul. Another connection between Des and hearts comes from the lyrics of the Guitar Hero song in Chapter 3, Raise Up Your Bet, which, while not likely written by Des, is inextricably tied to her by Tenna's dialogue in the scene prior. The last line is particularly Des-tied by the lyrics fitting the motif of Lost Girl, a theme that also heavily represents Des. The first line mentioning a demon heart is also notable, however, because we know Kris and Caddy at one point allegedly tried to summon a demon when they were kids, representing a potential origin to another heart-shaped soul, and potentially an opposite to the player-represented angel soul, but that's way off topic at this point, and a subject of plenty of other videos. Then we come to the knight's design. There have been comparisons made already about Kris's posing and actions being mirrored by the Roaring Knight, particularly one by Reddit user, longjumpingbit9359, that shows a handful. But I've been thinking more about this. The knight's sort of evasive ball-like form. It's very similar to how the soul reacts when Kris is threatened outside of combat. The size seems right, the rapid movement, the spinning pattern, it all seems a bit suspicious. Lastly, I want to talk about Dragon Blazers, and the references to it throughout the game. I'm going to speed through this. There's plenty of deep dives out there regarding this topic. We know from Susie talking to Gerson that Dragon Blazers is based on the prophecy, though some things have been changed. We know from Noelle's blog describing the cross-shaped maze rooms that the S-rank games are, at least in part, representative of Dragon Blazers, and by extension the prophecy. We know the White Hood is representative of Noelle, because the White Hood has the same ability to intuit their way through the maze, thereby leading us through it, and due to the alternate placeholder sprite for the White Hood, named OBJ, Bored Enemy Deer, plus of course her ice magic. deep breath, keep following me. The white hood represents Noel. Reasonably, we can assume the black goat monster that mirrors our movements represents Des. This goat monster, when flipping an inaccessible torial variable in the code, assigned to the entity named obj board enemy black deer, uses a black deer sprite as its unused alternate. On top of that, Susie, when talking about Dragon Blazers 2 all the way back in Chapter 2, mentions how your sister gets cursed. The reason this black goat monster representing Des is important is because as soon as you enter that room, the soul is in control of that monster. As much as we are possessing Mini Kris, we are also possessing this Mini Des, and once the two are no longer separated, our control prioritizes Mini Des over Mini Kris, with Mini Kris acting outside of our control to strike Des as she gets close. I said I didn't want to fall into the theory bucket filling trap, but looking at the script, this whole section has been just that. I want to try and rein this back in and try and look at why any of this matters. Because what definitely doesn't matter is which of these scenarios I've spent the last, 41 minutes laying out is the most likely, or what's really gonna happen. What matters is the exercise, taking the time and effort to digest and appreciate the media that you're enjoying. For me, I needed to talk about this flavor text, and I'm not done quite yet, because after all, I haven't finished painting our version of the tree I mentioned. We talked about the facts and figures, the literal and the evidence, but ultimately what matters to me is how we connect that with what our author, Toby Fox, is trying to tell us. Themes, the theoretical vegetables. We've had our junk food theorizing. Now it's time for a bit of thematic analysis so that we can feel like the content we just spent the last 40 minutes on wasn't pure brain rot. But this part can be a little boring, so instead of throwing Subway Surfers up on the screen to keep you engaged, instead you can watch me no-hitting the night while gathering footage for this video. What are we told within the first 5 minutes of launching Deltarune? No one gets to choose who they are in this world. No one gets to choose who they are or how the world views them. You don't have the agency to influence yourself, let alone the world around you. That's the external antagonistic force acting on the characters in Deltarune. You don't get to keep your wonderful vessel. Instead, you get to tear Kris's control of their own body away from them. Then Susie tells you, again, no choices, no determination to be made, because she feels just as trapped, just as helpless in a life with that agency stripped from her. Rousey comes along and tells us our journey is foretold by an unchangeable prophecy, and so on and so forth. Every chapter, the characters face an overwhelming sense of inevitability, an inability to change the course of their fate. I could probably make a whole nother video on this, but I think the central thread or theme tying Deltarune's chapters together right now is an exploration of where the line is between a healthy and an unhealthy way of rebelling against the Force, which says that you don't get to choose who you are. We see the healthy, we see Susie finding a place in which she feels like she doesn't have to keep up her tough exterior, and we see Rousey propped up by his friend's insistence that his opinions and feelings matter. But we see a hell of a lot more unhealthy ways of coping with that seemingly insurmountable obstacle. Asgore's unwillingness to accept the end of his marriage, driving him not only to further alienate himself from his family, but to inflict some amount of psychological unease on his own child. Rousey's utter lack of perceived self-worth. His willingness to sacrifice every amount of his own agency and happiness in order to appease others in the hopes that fate will change. Thirdly, struggling internally to maintain his own sense of smarts and self-worth, and attempting to project it externally by refusing the help of those he deems of lesser intelligence, while leaning heavily on the one person he views as smarter than himself. The Weird Route, an entire perversion of the game's events, where you try to wrest control of the narrative by subjugating its characters. And that's without touching on nearly every one of the game's chapter end and secret bosses. Why does this matter when looked at alongside all of our theorizing from the rest of this video? Because with this in mind, we can ask ourselves how any of these possibilities fit into this, or other thematic through lines that pervade Deltarune. If Carol, or the Vessel Creator, taught Kris about tearing their soul out at a young age, what fate were they trying to change? And are the consequences from that teaching going to mark this as a healthy or an unhealthy way of doing so? Could their attempts have caused whatever tragedy Kris still deals with today? Or be the reason that Des is lost to them? Were they simply trying to disrupt prophecy at any expense of themselves like Rousey? If Des was the first hometowner possessed by a human soul, is Kris just another repeated attempt? The same method with the same doomed outcome? Like Asgore trying desperately to fix his marriage with another bouquet of flowers, doomed to blossom in the garbage can? How do Kris, Ralsei, and Susie ultimately avert tragedy without spawning something even greater? Hey, post-editing Soda Man here. Thanks for watching this behemoth of a video. I've never made something like this before, so apologies for the scuffed editing. I'm normally a software developer by trade, game dev by hobby, so video making and script writing are well outside my wheelhouse, but I had a lot of fun making it. I'm expecting about 4 people to have actually watched this thing, so if you're one of those 4, I'm impressed you stuck it all the way through. This cute little profile picture, the shadow guy with the soda, was made by my good friend Flame Cannon, so thanks to him for that, and for all the feedback he gave me on the script for this video. If anything comes up that I need to correct or add, it'll be in a pinned comment below. I'm supposed to say subscribe and like and stuff, I think, but you do what you want. Till next time, maybe. I've got ideas.